This is a new approach for us, but we're working with the Avalon Foundation, and so we're going to be going for about 30 minutes about your candidacy for the Talbot County Council.
Terrific.
And I just think it would be helpful if we could understand a little bit more about your background. I think it's fascinating, your own journey before you got to Talbot County and what you've been doing here, and then we can get into this other stuff.
Super. So I was born in a suburb of Pittsburgh, and I was born to a really powerful faith community in which was a very active congregation that walked its talk. And I learned from a very early age that it was my responsibility to help the most vulnerable in particular, to look out for, biblically speaking, the widow and the orphan, and we now know that to mean anybody who's in a vulnerable position, as well as the stranger. I took that role very seriously. From the time I was a little kid, I would donate a portion of my allowance to charity. I ran the Trick or Treat for UNICEF program in my community in my teens. I did my first political canvassing when I was 13.
For who?
The truth is, I remember the going door to door more than I remember who it was. I believe it was a mayoral candidate, but I have more memories of actually going door to door. And of course, who would be cruel to a 13-year-old? So it was a good experience. Yeah.
And how did you wind up here?
I first came to the Eastern Shore in the 80s with an old boyfriend. To Betterton Beach of all places. And I fell in love with the shore. I fell in love with Natty Bo's land of pleasant living, and knew that I always wanted to make my home here. And apparently the forces were aligned, because every time I tried to move away, something brought me back. Yeah, so even after that relationship ended, I worked for NCR for a while. This was my territory.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And then Easton, how did Easton come about?
Easton came about because of all the places that I've lived. And I've lived in Kent, and I've lived in Queen Anne, and I've lived in Dorchester. Talbot feels like home. There is something so incredibly special about this community. The level of volunteering, the commitment to the community, the shared love of place, the small town feel of the whole county. There's nothing like it. I can't imagine living anywhere else.
It's one thing to love a place. It's another thing to run for office.
It most certainly is.
And I'm also interested in that journey. And did you wake up at 3:00 in the morning and say, I have to run, or was there an issue that you felt you just simply could not avoid?
It was a little of both.
Okay.
It was sparked in many ways by the 2016 presidential election and the ugliness in the political process that brought to the fore. And I didn't want this country that I love so much to continue in that mode. And I kept looking around saying, somebody's got to do something. And then I had the moment where I looked around and said, oh wait, that person needs to be me. Yeah. And I really feel like we're fighting for the soul of our country. And I feel like that battle begins at home.
Yeah.
That's why I'm running here.
Well, and it's interesting as you look at this county, and as I was saying earlier, one thing we know for certain, this county will grow.
Yes, it will.
It's just inevitable that we will have a very high, proportionate to our other counties, growth rate. And so the question of how it grows is not only an issue, but can be a painful issue. So as I've watched this conversation about particularly the Bay 100 and the extension of water and sewer and this feeling from the community that they have not been listened to, all accumulated into a very intense conversation.
Yes, it did. I was there for much of it.
Yeah, so what's your take on all that in terms of that kind of balance, or maybe there more proportionality in terms of growth and development?
I think any growth and development that we do has to be both sensible and sensitive. One of the many things that makes this county fabulous is our natural resources. Mm-hmm. The coastline, the water, recreational activities on the water, the vibrant and bucolic countryside. Mm-hmm. Those are the things that are very much going to attract growth, but too much growth has the risk of undermining those very qualities that draw people to the county. I mentioned having lived in Queen Anne County. I lived at the end of Romancoke Road near the Romancoke Pier. Mm. When I lived there, it took 15 minutes to get up to Route 50. Mm. It now can take as much as an hour. Mm. It is lined with developments of people who wanted to take advantage of all that Queen Anne County had to offer, but the quality of life has been changed dramatically by that. I don't want to see that happening here.
But on the other side, there are people who have had land that they want to monetize. There is a need for workforce housing. There's all sorts of cofactors to what I would call the opposition to your point of view.
Absolutely. I favor primarily infill development. So I favor development in the towns and in the corridors around the towns that are already identified as places for development. We're going to see changes in the brick and mortar retail landscape as more and more commerce moves to the internet. Some of those areas may be available for redevelopment. I would love to see higher density development take place in those areas where we already have the infrastructure to facilitate the growth there. I would like to see development that happens elsewhere be low density and be sensitive to buffer zones, forested buffer zones along creeks, so that we are protecting the quality of water. Every time we do development and we increase the amount of impervious surface that we have, that's more runoff. So I think that the development that we need to do has to take those things into consideration with the kinds of roofs that are put in place, with how much paving is done, with how big the footprints are. So I'm all for people being able to monetize their property within limits, but I am very cautious about private gain at public cost.
And did you take a position on this rental property challenge that we went through?
I did take a position on it. I think that there are great locations for short-term rentals that are limited and well-regulated. I don't think they should be in small, dense communities where neighbors aren't on top of one another. I think that owners should be on the property, and I think we should put a limit on the number that can be here. We also need to enforce the rules that we have in place, and that includes shutting down the unlicensed short-term rentals that are number nearly as many as the licensed. I would have liked to have seen some common sense additions, including the limitations in number and the insistence on insurance.
And did you have any criticism of the process itself? The decision is one thing, but would you have changed how, I guess it was 1305, I can't remember the...
Well, I have concerns with the entirety of the whole Next Step 190 process. And it goes to a larger concern that I have, which has to do with the way that things are communicated into the community. Mm-hmm. So there was an effort made to communicate that this Next Step 90 process was happening and that there were hearings out in the community. The publication happened primarily in the newspaper and other news sources, including the Talbot Spy. But I don't think most people, including myself, until I decided to run and get involved in these issues, understood what the implications were. I don't think we did a good job as a county government of letting people know what the implications were going to be in this. Mm-hmm. And so people didn't understand and didn't get involved, frankly, until the backyard chicken issue came to the fore. And suddenly people realized the way that what seems like a dry process of revising a code would actually affect daily life. I think had more people understood the implications earlier, we may not have had such a last-minute protest, and people may have felt more involved in the decision-making process. Having said that, everything that I saw at all the meetings that I attended over the last year the vast majority of what I heard was in favor of strong regulation of short-term rentals, of keeping noise where it was, and of limiting development in areas where new sewer is going to go. And I did not hear all that much other than from purely commercial interests in support of those issues. And I have a concern with that.
Switching gears a little bit, another thing that eventually gets to the county level is the school budget. And so we live in a state that requires what they call a maintenance of effort,
Correct.
which is mandated. And so that is the goal, but in many cases, this does not actually reach the point of fundability for the school district. And so counties are having to go through this really challenging debate of putting more resources at a time when seniors are asking for help. All these different pressures are on the council. What's your take on this? What's your approach to that kind of budget decision?
As things are structured right now, every council is stuck between a rock and a hard place. We're stuck between the unfunded mandates for education and a revenue cap that handicaps our ability to raise additional revenue. There is going to be a ballot initiative, as I understand it, this fall to make some changes to the revenue cap, but it is not addressing the cap itself. And the cap itself is always going to keep us in the same position, because when you restrict revenue to a level where it can't even meet the natural increases in existing costs, you're never going to be able to meet all of these other needs. So I think it is something that the council needs to address. I think it's going to be a process of education, because people are afraid that if we get rid of that changing the revenue cap equals an increase in taxes, and that's not necessarily the case. Right now we have only limited short-term benefit from any new development that comes online in terms of increased revenue. It's only in certain circumstances in that first year that we get any benefit. More development could likely result in decreased levels of taxes. And I think until we address the revenue side of this, we're never going to come up with good answers for this. And I frankly, at the state level, I think there's some frustration about the state subsidizing, so to speak, a relatively wealthy county with the lowest tax rate in the state. I love that low tax rate, but there are implications to having it.
Have you been familiar with the Kerwin report?
Yes, I am.
Are you in favor of their recommendations? You don't know. It just comes up. I realize that this whole issue of maintenance of effort may not be the most realistic funding approach anymore.
Yeah, and they're working on it. I haven't gone into the guts of it, but I can tell you that I'm extremely glad that these issues are being revisited. The world changes too fast. I've been in the schools. Things are changing. It's not the classrooms that it was when I was growing up. We have so many kids who, for all sorts of reasons, have not been well socialized to be able to begin their education. We have 22, possibly now 23 different languages spoken in the classrooms. There's technology in the classrooms that didn't exist, let alone be present in the, I come from the days where you wheeled the television in on the cart. So the nature of education is very different, and it changes quickly, and it must, to keep up with a world that's changing quickly. So I'm glad we're addressing, at a state level and a local level, those changes and looking for ways to keep our schools providing a good education for our kids.
As you know, we've been having a birthday party all year for a Talbot County resident. His name was Frederick Douglas.
Yes.
And it just was just inevitable that, given this 200th year, we do talk about diversity and race relations. I've been covering Talbot for, I don't know, probably 7-8 years intensively, maybe longer. And this chapter on the courthouse lawn was a particularly difficult one for the
Yes.
community. But, I would like to get your assessment on where we are in our embrace of diversity and in terms of how we get along with each other in this important year.
I'm glad you brought up the Frederick Douglass Bicentennial. I'm actually on that committee, and have been really grateful for the opportunities to learn and to connect with people that I might never have met otherwise. I think that the issue of race in this community is there is not one answer. There are portions of this community who are acknowledging that we continue to have a problem and wanting to make a change. There are people who are in denial about the fact that we have a problem. There are people who feel helpless. And I'm fascinated by the way a symbol like the Talbot Boy statue can elicit such different responses. And I think those responses say something about where we are as a county. So I've been asking people as I go around, how do they react to the statue? Not whether it should stay or go, but what is their reaction? So I've spoken with a white woman who looks at the statue regularly in going to her office, and she sees a little boy going home in defeat. And she sees it as a monument to the tragedy of war. Mm-hmm. And she sees it as a mother, and she sees that child as a mother. I've spoken with a white man who is a descendant of one of the families whose names are on that monument. He finds it offensive and would like to see it at least removed from the courthouse lawn, if not from the county entirely. I've spoken with African American men and women who see it as an object of intimidation and are unable, I don't want to say unable, are, when they see it through the eyes of people who lived through the Jim Crow era and recognize the connection of that statue to the Jim Crow era. And I've talked to younger African Americans who say we have much bigger problems in that county. Let's not focus on that. And I think that's where the state of race relations are in this county. There have been a lot of conversations on race. Most of the people who engage in those conversations are the people who are well-meaning and looking to make change, but I'm not sure how we address reaching people's hearts and minds.
So would you be open to the suggestion of moving that statue?
I'd like to see it, whether we move it or keep it where it is, I would like to see it contextualized. Because right now, there is no context for it. So I would like to have some way in which its origins were explained, and maybe even examples of the things that I just spoke of posted. Yeah. Different.
The Spy did an editorial on this very thing. Just get some signage up. Yeah. It doesn't cost anything. It helps everybody understand why it's there, what was the context of this. Yeah. And I just feel like I almost call it low-hanging fruit, because it's just like it's a Band-Aid perhaps, but at least it gives the sense that we know what this might represent.
And it becomes an opportunity for engagement, right, and conversation, which I think is far more important if we're going to address the race situation in the county than hiding something in the short term.
Yeah. One thing that I also kind of focused on and want to do even more programming on is workforce housing.
Yes.
I mean, it comes up in terms of the Bay 100, but this is a real problem. And it's going to take a lot of different groups coming together to solve Correct. It. But maybe you have an approach that you're bringing up as a part of your platform.
Well, one of the first things that we need to do is define what we mean by workforce housing, because that can mean a lot of different things. So at one level, it means houses that people are working in making a reasonable living can afford to purchase, put down a down payment, make payments, own, and occupy. So that is one level of workforce housing. Often people talk about sheriff's deputies and teachers, for example. But that's not the only housing crisis that we have here. In order for a single person to live in Talbot County, that person needs to be earning about $16 an hour minimum. Most of the new job creation here is in the $10 to $11 an hour range, and that's for home health care and for tourist-based industries. So there we have a problem with, at that rate, not only can people not afford to accumulate money for a down payment or be able to get mortgages to purchase houses, but finding rental properties to live in is almost impossible. So one of the concerns I have with short-term rentals is it actually drives the cost of long-term rentals up.
I see.
So I think we need to be looking at what we mean by workforce housing, right? Addressing both levels, both rental and moderately priced purchase. I think we need to find incentives to make it easier for people to get into housing. And I think we need to look at the kind of job creation that we're doing to make sure that we are creating jobs that will allow people to stay in the county, as opposed to, for example, our teachers and our sheriff's deputies, who we want to have so closely connected to this community, are living in Caroline County and putting more pressure on the roads in the county coming in.
You know, we've covered a lot of different areas, but I always like to leave the end to the candidates, because I'm sure I missed some stuff that you're eager to be known as taking a position on. Are there things we've left off that you'd like to kind of, or the other question, of course, is the big differential. What are you bringing to the table, as they say, that may make this a better council?
Those are really terrific questions. So let me start with the second one first. I think that one of the things that I bring to the council is a long career of building bridges across various boundaries. I've done it in the boardroom. I've done it in the classroom. For example, I teach a class on the biblical book of Exodus right now to a group of people who are Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, none of the above, and the occasional Buddhist. And we find ways to engage with this text, to have our differences, to talk about the different interpretations without eliminating anybody's perspective, to draw meaning from it. And I love that. I'm also the mother of 2 stepdaughters who I acquired when they were teenagers. And let me tell you that bridge building in the family room is the hardest bridge building I've ever done. But all of this means finding some common ground. And that goes back to my original reason for why I decided to run. We need to start building bridges to common ground based on mutual respect and mutual responsibility. And in order to do that, we need to start talking to one another and communicating with one another. We need a council that is going to respect all the members of the community. It's going to listen to them and take them seriously and represent everybody. And I think I'm the person to do that job, or one of them.